All right, welcome to episode number 9 of the Rooster's Crow podcast. I was very blessed and pleased to have Jordan Hall on for a very edifying and enriching conversation. Jordan is one of those few people that when I see their videos pop up on YouTube, I almost drop everything and watch them. He is one of, if not my favorite interlocutor of John Vervaeke's and Jonathan Peugeot's actually. And I think the convergence of these three people, their thought, their thinking, and what they're bringing to the table is something that is what interests me kind of the most. So I would put Jordan, on kind of my Mount Rushmore of sense makers in the world right now. So I was very pleased to be able to have a conversation with him. We've been talking back and forth, via text and for a few years now, and we finally were able to carve out some time to connect. Really appreciate it very much. We talked a lot about Game B, and we talked a lot about how what needs to happen for the new to get off the ground. We talked a little bit about his background growing up. We talked about symbolism. We talked about reciprocal relevance realization, what that means, how that term came about. We talked about a lot of different things. So I'm sure, and I hope that you guys enjoy it. I enjoyed it very much. So without further ado, I give to you guys Jordan Hall. Jordan Hall, thank you, sir, for joining me. I appreciate your very busy time very, very much. Thank you so much. Welcome to the Rooster's Crow podcast.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a long time coming. We've known each other for a while. This is the first time I think that we've actually had a conversation.
Yes, outside the virtual text space, this is, and I'm excited about it. We have a lot of overlap, and maybe we'll get into it with regards to Deleuze, and the effect that he had on my cognition, like reading him and getting into that, and trying to find other Deleuzians out there, not people that are studying Deleuze philosophically, but are applying those techniques, to applying that rubric to the world. And I think that's what made me resonate really with your work a lot. So, I got a few questions that we can jump in there. But first, I'd love to hear about, what were your parents like? What was growing up like? And what was Jordan like in middle school and high school?
Yeah. So you, okay, go back to elementary school a little bit.
Yes, please.
Because there was a big chasm between elementary school and middle school. Mm-hmm. So, my parents are Texans from two of the, there's many lineages. Texas actually is a bit of a melting pot. My father's line is, largely the kind of Anglo-German Polish, like Eastern European, with a pretty strong military background. My grandfather was one of the people who was pulled out of kind of redneck poverty by World War II in the GI Bill, and then he also fought in Korea. My dad fought in Vietnam. Both pilots, so wow. A very specific flavor. And my mom's line are Ashkenazi Jews, Russia, Cilicia, that region. And as I recall, this is at some point almost sort of becoming folklore in my own head. I can't guarantee that what I'm about to say is exactly right, but it's sort of in the right direction. That there was three brothers who came over on the boat from Russia, and two of them got off the boat in Ellis Island, and the youngest, for some reason, got bounced and ended up at the sort of the second destination for Eastern European Jews, which was Galveston, Texas. And so they mixed with the community there in the beginning of the 20th century, and for reasons that are still a little bit mysterious, my mom went to University of Colorado Boulder, and was, you could imagine, in the late 60s, early 70s, was quite in the sort of summer of love hippie vibe. And my dad was in the Corps of Cadets at Texas A&M, which is almost exactly the polar opposite. Maybe the Citadel's a little bit more intense, but not a lot. And then I'm pretty sure that my mom, so I know my mom transferred. They met at Texas A&M, and I'm pretty sure she was actually the very first class of women that were admitted to Texas A&M. Where, by the way, I went and my sister went, and like all my uncles. So it's a very Texas and Texas A&M family. If you know Texas, there's a specific flavor there. Mm-hmm. My early childhood was military. My dad was in the Air Force, so we moved around and did that military thing. He retired though when I was just getting into elementary school. So we had a few moves in kindergarten and first grade, second grade, but then was pretty solid until fifth grade. And up until the point where I got married, or until I met my current partner, like I always defined the third or second through fifth grade as being the good part of life. And then two things happened after that, which was moving in. We actually moved into the country, so out of the suburbs of San Antonio into a town called Helotes, actually outside of Helotes, which is sort of like an hour-long bus ride to school in the morning, and going from elementary school to middle school, which sucked big time.
Yeah.
And what was it? So the kid that was in middle school and high school, I had no girlfriends, not one. I went on a couple of dates, like 2 or 3. Lots of comic books, lots of science fiction, lots and lots of like role-playing games, early computers, maddening, kids these days, maddening experience of not having internet or any connectivity, so just the computer, which was a very different experience. Living in the country, there was almost no kids even around where we lived, and the ones who were around weren't particularly good partners for me in terms of friendship. So I had a small number of friends. We were like in Gen X, so the latchkey kid vibe, and having to sort of cajole your parents into taking you to a sleepover. Like we didn't do play dates, but we did do sleepovers. And still kind of connecting with mostly the friends that I'd made in elementary school, although a cohort arose that I hung out with, particularly after we could drive. And then the other piece maybe is as early as third grade, having a just deep, like intuitive and physical sense of the wrongness of school in all the ways. Like I'm not learning anything here, and it's painful, and it's taking all of my time, and the authoritarianism of it and the mediocrity of it. Like there's just a very unpleasant experience. But of course, the experience of also being relatively powerless vis-a-vis that. And so having to learn guerrilla warfare, like how to learn how to create temporary autonomous zones, as our friend Hakeem Bey coined it for us Gen Xers. Yeah. And, exiting high school was a very existentialist, as one often gets into I think the Brave New World and the we call it The Stranger and things like that, deeply reading into the French existentialist and frankly feeling it, like kind of being done with it already by the age of 18. And who knew? Life continues to throw all kinds of crazy, painful things at you.
Yeah, that's great. I just jot down some notes. So if you see me kind of looking down here, so I want to get into your experience of the French existentialists because I engaged with them around the same time. But what was your understanding, your upbringing with regards to religion, and what were the thoughts that were flowing around in your head about God as a child and a teenager?
So again, for me, things are very tied to lineage, because my experience of my parents and my experience of life, and they're still married, they're just so different. Even like at a political level, as you might imagine, my dad voted for Reagan and my mom voted for Mondale, if you remember those periods of time. And she's very politically active. So we lived and we were in Texas. It was a very, household of contradictions. Neither of my parents had a particular, or still do have a particular connection to religion. So my mom is a reformed. Her parents were reformed, and so she's even more reformed. And my dad's dad was that kind of the World War II era sort of recovered Catholic or secularized Catholic. So I was kind of in a household where there was an ambient vibe, particularly growing up in Texas, still in the 70s and 80s, a familiarity with the architectures of mostly Christianity, and actually mostly Protestant Christianity. but also some awareness. Like I did a little bit of Hanukkah, a little bit of Yom Kippur, just every once in a while, kind of dipping in. But frankly, at my mother's knee, also spending time on, we would go and visit local Native American gatherings and do drum circles, and take a look at we call it the perennial philosophy stuff, reading, but not a lot, not like diving deep, just kind of tasting it and touching it. And I'd actually just remember both of my parents telling me relatively young, like maybe even like 10 or 11, that it was my responsibility to figure this out for myself. So my experience was one of like really, I remember actually walking home from elementary school, like in 4th grade, and having like the question come up of like, what is worth wanting? Like what are values, like at the deep level, like what are values that are good values? But as a question, like a real question, no answer at all. And spent years, and probably still spend years reflecting on that. And then, the tenor of the times, the rise of the cultural environment that we were sort of seeing so much of right now, had a, if you go to a friend's house and the friend's family prays before dinner, a feeling of uncomfortableness, a feeling that that's a little bit kind of backward or weird, not normal, and maybe a little bit, what's the right term for it? Not negative. It's more like,
not cliche. I know exactly what we're talking about, like antiquated.
Yeah, like backward, like a little bit like, I mean, almost frankly, a little bit of a sense of superiority.
What do you think that comes from, that sense? Because I agree, and thinking through things of Christianity, even saying the word Jesus and whatnot, where does this sense, this exact quality of sensation that you're talking about here that I resonate with, where does that come from? Why does that show up?
That's a very deep question. I mean, some of the things that come to my mind is, I'll put it in a simple way, cultural programming, but I mean specifically, right? So we have a narrative. We have the narrative of the what is it? The Scopes monkey trial. And we have that in our cultural vernacular, particularly if you're of the college educated cohort. And the moral of the story of the monkey trial was enlightened, intelligent, honest, and by the way, erudite, educated city folk coming into a place filled with sort of squinty-eyed, degenerate, angry, myth-ridden, probably bug-ridden rural folk, and having to fight for truth, justice, and the American way against these sort of decrepit vermin, more or less. Like that's the moral of that story. Yeah. And I think stories like that were really beginning to be commonplace in the developmental environment of the 1970s. What I would say is something like the reject your father vibe that kicked off the boomer environment had a kind of a wave. And to be perfectly frank, I think also the GI generation also had a pretty heavy rejection of their cultural environment. So you had like a couple of generations of religiosity is connected with both a bad and backwardsness. The binding between so the civil rights struggle and racism and sort of strong fundamental style, not fundamentalists that came later, I think, but that sort of the stronger evangelical Southern Baptist energy and vibe and accent and language and verbiage. And then, of course, we had the great secular explosion of the, let's call it I'll name it, but I don't necessarily believe it, the unbridled success of technical materialism, the futurist hope of the 50s and 60s that once again, rational, scientific, clear-headed method could bring us heaven on earth. And so the hopium of believing things that aren't true, we don't have to do anymore. And to do so is to sort of be held back and to be behind the thing. Stuff like that. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff, but I think that's kind of the essence of it.
Yeah. No, no, that resonates. And, I see it again, kind of rooted in the 60s and, with the whole intellectual postmodern movement, especially obviously with Freud prior to that, and this idea of the name of the father, and then Lacan with changing that up, and it is this whole idea of the patriarchy, right? The patriarchy, I think, is a word that encapsulates this idea of why these people are subject to the patriarchy and are unaware. We're breaking out of the patriarchy in a sense, and it's just interesting that that seems to have culminated. The hope that inspired culminated. It was in the 80s and culminated like in the late 90s. Since then, really since 9/11, has been fracturing down. And that whole hope. I think a lot of the root of the current nihilism and the meaning crisis comes from that failing in front of us and not having anything else to grab onto. Now that's
Right, right. I mean, this same thing with World War One, right? The breaking of the Victorian consensus, the notion that there was a toolkit, we know how to solve problems. It's just a matter of time. Like we're getting there. And then holy shit, like we're way over our head. This ain't working at all. In fact, it's more horrible than we could possibly imagine. And then a huge demoralization.
Mm-hmm.
Can I put a little bit more first person in there? I'm not sure if it matters,
Sure.
but there's just a little bit. I actually recall, I have like a very strong recollection of one of the more religious kids in elementary school, Kirsten Hieronymus, by the way. Um, at a certain point in, call it like third or fourth grade, some combination of, oh, you're a Jew, oh, you're going to hell.
Mm-hmm.
And feeling like, well, that seems real harsh. Like, holy shit, like that's it, we're done. I'm like 9 and I'm going to hell because of this. Right. That seems brutal, and therefore, a rejection of that. I'm like, okay, well, fuck that,
Mm-hmm.
And then the other one, I actually also recall having in a different moment, having the same thing. Like there's an architecture of my identity, in this case being a Jew, which has a characteristic that the likelihood of my being able to be, say, president is 0. And as it turns out, empirically the case. I'm not sure if that's really the case, but like a felt sense of it. So and again, like that felt sense of that being deeply unfair. And then you show up in a context where you're at dinner with a bunch of folks who you're like, oh shit, like these are these people who treat other people unfairly, and are associated with let's call it an ideology that is horribly backwards and probably unclean. And then you've got a little bit of the basic energy, but at the same time, and these are nice people. Like these are my best, my friends' parents. They're maybe a little bit weird in certain ways, but so is everybody. And I feel comfortable and safe when they're feeding me dinner. Right. So this is not a simple thing. Okay.
Yeah. Wonderful. Take that snapshot and let's apply it to a story you told. You were talking with John Vervaeke and I think Greg Henriquez, and you were at college, you were at Harvard, and there was this friend that you had there. And one year, he got into Christianity. He got into, I forgot what it was specifically. And so you guys had just differing views of what consciousness is. But you saw the next year of his life, his relationship started getting better. He just had a more healthy vibe about him.
Yeah.
What happened there?
You mean like what's the more to it?
Well, what do you think it was that happened to him to have that reflection on you to notice that? Why did that become relevant to you that you brought it up in a story years later? What was it?
That's a good question. Why did it leave a mark is what you're saying? Well, that's a very hard question to answer. I mean, you're going to have some priors on that one.
Yeah.
And what's the underlying? He would say that that God was trying to send me a message, and that's why, right? And that's why it laid so much of a mark. So we already were in the process of then imposing a presupposition of how you go about making sense of events to even be able to inquire to that particular question, which of course is true of all questions. Well, one aspect of it is very similar to where we were just at. Right? So preconceiving, my preconceptions loaded an individual who wore a GOP hat, the equivalent of a MAGA hat back in 1994 at Harvard Law School, which was contra everybody else, right? As being sort of off. Yeah. The hell's that all about? And then having conversations where he had different opinions and different perspectives than good opinion. It's like, well, he's off the beaten path. What's going on here? But smart.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in conversations, and not just like smart in a mean way, like smart and also there's a heart there, like heartfelt. Like, this is like a person you can actually have a conversation with, and there's learning, like a felt sense of, oh wow, there's something happening here. So attention gets paid for me. Like, I pay attention to people who show up like that. I guess now what I would say is that I am highly attracted to good anomalies, something like that. And so we were friends. We spent time together, and then I just noticed that aspects or characteristics of the way he showed up that had always been a little bit negative, like things like, he used to dip, like tobacco, and growing up in Texas, I'm sort of familiar with that, but it's a bad habit. And that just went away. His language changed, his demeanor changed, and all in a way that, again, felt like they were an actual improvement. It's like, there's something, it feels like this is a good thing. There's a goodness going on here. It feels more positive. You know how that goes. It's hard to put your finger on it, but it's clear. And then he just mentioned, that he had had what do you call it? He was reborn. And he was already a Christian going in, but he was definitely like a lot more committed, and relationship, wife, the whole thing. And so there was just the jarringness again of that frame of evangelical Christianity being per se a mess, and then a first person felt experience of somebody who already was an interesting good anomaly, becoming, from my point of view at least, healthier. And the key, you used the word right, healthier. In the context of this was just what is the term? I guess, again, anomaly. Like the record needle scratched, and the ability to force perception into preconceived frames, for me at least, couldn't hold. And that's where you learn, right? When those things break so you learn. So what I would say is maybe that was an eye-opening experience, a moment of, first person experienced authentically, like actually from a open, heartfelt place, bent the egoic framing of what is. And those don't happen that often.
Yeah.
And so it leaves a mark.
Yeah. Beautifully said. And this actually brings up kind of the next question I wanted to go. You're familiar with McLuhan? Have you read some McLuhan?
I am familiar with McLuhan. Yeah.
Have you read his the New Science, and familiar with the tetrad?
I am familiar with the tetrad, but I'm not. I wouldn't say I'm facile with it. I couldn't run tetrads with my eyes closed.
Yeah. What that brought up, and he has this concept. McLuhan has this concept of anti-environment, right? So through the different media that recedes into the background, and we just to pay attention to the content in our lives. The actual framing is done outside of awareness. And he claims that it's the role of the artist to create anti-environments, to create these shifts, to perturb the environment, for it to disclose itself, the antagonism of whatever it may be, like it was with your friend there. He says the role of the artist is to create anti-environments. And in that sense, I was going to show this to you. I posted this on the Game B, the Facebook page. Here, let me share it real quick. Share it with my screen. And I asked the question, was the GameStop situation an anti-environment? No, I'm sorry. I posted it on the McLuhan Facebook page, but then I posted this on the Game B Facebook page, right? GameStop, we know what's happening with games. Can you see it there?
Yeah, I see it. Yeah.
It's just a simple, silly meme here. But so is this a sort of anti-environment where we see this event happen and
there are no silly memes?
Yeah, right.
Memes are the most deadly serious of media of all possible.
Even the sillier ones are even more, right? Like the frog, Pepe the Frog.
Oh my God, dude. That's I mean, just think about what I was talking with some folks about that, like AI. Just think about it just as a heuristic. AI is not going to understand memes. Like that's like the Turing test par excellence. It's like, can the AI get the meme? Because there's so much depth and context, and the ability to actually bind multiple different things that have deep, rich, and subtle context together in a new way to create what is effectively always insight, right? Memes are effectively shamanic medicine in media form. It's a powerful, powerful thing. So anyway, but a silly meme.
Yeah, no, that's great. That just brought up a lot for me there. But a question that I was going to ask you is what is the role of the artist in Game B?
So what I think I hear you saying is more along the lines of what is the role of the artist in the emergence or the discovery or the transition to Game B, and not the role of the artist in the context of what if we happen to be in Game B, or do you
Yeah,
mean both?
no, that maybe both, but there's this Wyndham Lewis quote. He says that the artist is is engaged in writing a detailed history of the future because he's the only one who can live in the present. And it's about intuiting the environment. And a lot of times when civilizations become calcified, it's the role of the artist to point outside the walls and revivify the civilization in order to give it more life. What happens when the civilization disintegrates? What is the role of the artist to unite, to create the new? So that's kind of the context there.
Ooh, all right. Well, so I feel like what we need to do right now is maybe disambiguate this term. I want to invoke Kars, James P., who I think really did some good work in helping us to separate the artist from the artifact. Right? It's the Buddhist sand painting that gets blown away the moment that it's done. So the first question would just actually be, what is the artist? What do we mean when we actually say that? Because obviously we don't mean art. We don't mean paint. Right? We don't mean sculptures. We probably don't mean black turtlenecks and cigarettes, right? There's something artifacts or artifice that has been dragged along with the soul of the artist. So what do we mean by that? And what I would say is that there's something very proximal. There's something very close between this this persona, this notion of the artist, and the notion of the prophet. Right? There's something very similar. Maybe the prophet's maybe more of a punk rock artist. There's something about the lo-fi-ness of the prophet, but they're very close. Right? The artist. Remember, I did a piece about Scenius.
I believe so. Sounds familiar. I would have seen
So,
it though. Yeah.
so there's a concept called Scenius that Brian Eno put into the vernacular, and I was asked to study it by my friend Sebastian Paquette. So I looked into it. I really contemplated it, and I said, Scenius is the genius of the scene, is the notion, but it has a characteristic of pick anything that's really meaningfully happened, and generally it's a scene. Whether it's impressionism or it's existentialism or it's punk rock or skateboarding or scientific method or whatever, right? There's always some collection of people, and it kind of unfolds in a very particular way, which is that there's a period of time where it's not named, a period of time where it's happening, but nobody knows that it's happening, and nobody knows who else is doing it. You're just doing it. And the people who are early in are usually a little bit weird, a little bit, let's call them visionary or freaky or broken or tuned in, pick your poison. But they have this thing where they can nod to each other when they begin to see somebody else. You're like, oh, wait a minute, dude. You are tuned into kind of the same vibe I'm tuned into. That's interesting. I can see the beauty that you're producing in a way that other people can't see it, because I can kind of, like you say, it's coming from the future, but I can also see the future, brother. And by the way, always intermediated by the fact that you got some pretty broken folks, as their ability to actually cooperate as humans may actually get a hell of a lot in the way. But the Scenius then begins to emerge. It reveals itself. It starts to name itself. Different roles begin to show up. It becomes more and more embodied. Eventually, it gets coined. A coinage lands. It's not cyberspace. It's not the interwebs. It's not the digital superhighway. It's the internet, right? It just sort of settles. And then it moves through a different stage of its development. Usually it closes. It becomes sort of an enclosure, and then it becomes extracted, and then it evaporates, usually, but not always. In the incipients I proposed in that consideration, there were three primary roles that are now that I know Forrest Landry, I would put them in a triadic relationship. But essentially there was what I called the source. And the source is kind of like the Velvet Underground or the Pixies, right? It's the character where if you don't know the scene, you probably haven't even heard of them. But if you do know the scene, you're like, yeah, those are the fucking guys. Is that thing, the one who really, really is the closest to the transcendent energy of the thing that is being expressed, but isn't necessarily the best at expressing it, and definitely isn't the most attractive in expressing it. So then you've got the charismatic. The charismatic is the one who renders the scene into livingness, the one who makes it attractive to other people to want to participate, learns how to convert the energy of the scene into currencies that are legible to people who aren't in the scene. The guy who gets laid because he's a rock star, right? And be
Right.
like, holy shit, you can get laid by being a rock star? Hold on, what is that? I want
Right.
to get closer to that thing. Who, by the way, the kind of the weird skinny guy with long hair and definitely can't throw a football who gets laid because he's a rock
Mm-hmm.
star. You're like, okay, something's changed. And then you have the artist, right? Which is the point why I came here. And the artist
Mm-hmm.
is the one who has the skillfulness of rendering the artifacts that embody the scene into the world. Right? So in skateboarding, somebody who invents the ollie, the ollie is an artist move. Like, holy shit, dude, the entire scene just moved forward. You just found a way to sort of like speak out into the world, render the logos into the world such that there is now a language, the producing of the language, the rendering of the grammar into expression.
Mm-hmm.
Is the artist. So the role of the artist in Game B now is what I just said. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Is to be able to perceive clearly the essence of the thing that is trying to embody itself in the world, and then clarify and render that grammar into expression such that it can in fact begin the process of being what it is in itself. Right?
Mm-hmm.
It's the grammarian, and I don't mean that in a sort of sophomore English teacher kind of way. It's the guy who articulates the goes from the deep code into the coding language so that you can actually begin to use this thing and write it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the context of Game B, because the nature of Game B, we have the next move, which is, as you say, there's a consciousness of the necessity and the difficulty of maintaining continuity of contact with source.
Mm-hmm.
You can't have this scene close. It cannot become a closed scene. It cannot become a finite space. The artist is that who renders the connection to the infinite, right? That's the specialization of the artist, of keeping the channel open to the infinite and bringing the infinite in for the continual disruption and renewal of the thing that is present here in the world. And of course, that would be from a Deleuzian postscriptive societies of control, dividual characteristic of all things that are currently individuals. Right? Each of us cultivates the artist within, and we all cultivate the artistic relationship between and among.
Beautiful. Yeah. So is the finite an expression of the infinite, right? So the artist is an expression of the infinite. That's kind of what came to mind there. And it's interesting what you're talking about. I'm just reading through McLuhan and his distinction between visual and acoustic space. And he says that we've been captured by this visual space because of the phonetic alphabet, and the way that the phonetic alphabet doesn't inherently have meaning. The Hebrew writing, the Chinese ideogram, all of these writings were symbols that symbolized the real world. So there was this kind of one-to-one connection. And then you had the alphabet, which you had the vowels, and then you had the consonants. And he says, like, the alphabet's like teeth, and the alphabet that just universalized and started eating everything brought us into this visual space with the Greeks. And we are just now coming out of this visual space into the acoustic space. Now, the acoustic space is what's being retrieved after after the visual space has been overcoded because of the alphabet here. Let me read a little bit from the book here, if you don't mind. That kind of speaks to this here. He says, having gleefully scrapped our traditions in headlong pursuit of the demon of progress, now that we Westerners embrace post-literacy, we find the roots or resonance in alphabetic. We find no roots or resonance in alphabetic culture. Prior to literacy, the job of transmitting the accumulated knowledge of the culture was given to the poets. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey are meticulously encoded encyclopedias of the arts, manners, sciences, and mores of his Greece. After writing, this is the underlined portion here. After writing, the logos was smashed and the oral establishment drowned in a sea of ink. Fragments of the old system were soon retrieved and recast in the pattern that became the trivium and the quadrivium, or 7 liberal arts. The trivium composed of grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic. The quadrivium, arithmetic, astronomy, geometry, and music. The trivium is our concern. All 3 of its elements are arts and sciences of language. So hold that one real quick, and just one more little paragraph here. Just this recap of the last chapter. He says, the present essay, which is this first chapter that talks about visual space, had its beginning in an effort to locate the origin of visual space as a Western paradigm. Its earliest expression seemed to be manifested in the new Greek science of dialectic, and its influence was responsible for the transition Comfort has labeled as from religion to philosophy. That is, the alphabetic ground of new sensibility was mimed and explored in several ways, one of the products of which was dialectic, as begun by the pre-Socratic philosophers, and another, the imposition of geometrical visual space. And then this last paragraph, the new metaphysical concerns with being adopted the form of abstract figures detached from the ground of immediate awareness. Previously, with mimesis, being had been immersed in the metamorphic and protein flux of everyone's daily experience. With the new ground of alphabetic awareness, objectivity and detachment became the rule. Mimesis was turned from a making process into representational matching, and the old experience of being was retrieved on the new terms of visual space, that is, as an abstract absolute. What are your responses of this idea of the phonetic alphabet being what we've been inculcated in, and we're moving out of that with the age of the electricity, and obviously now where we're at? I see a lot of resonances with the movement from game A, located in visual space, to game B, located in this acoustic simultaneous space.
Well, obviously
sorry,
a lot
there.
That was a lot. And it wasn't just like a lot of words. There was a lot of, like, it was dense.
Yeah.
So let's say I'm going to kind of hold on to a few things. So a lot came up for me. I'm going to try to see if I can piece some apart. So one piece, this is the practice of, Johnny V and I have talked about this reciprocal opening and reciprocal closing, and the practice of communication. I'm going to call it the first person, or in forced language, in the immanent, right? In the groundingness, that there's a way for us to actually connect at the level of experience, at the level of life, that the words are pointers, they're nudging us into a shared experientiality, even if it's in memory. But the bandwidth back and forth of the conversation creates a process whereby we actually kind of come into a shared consciousness, and we come to a shared space.
It's like participatory, right?
Yeah, participatory, and it's mutual participatory. Like there's a transformation going on. There's an intrinsic growth or growing or disruption, like life is happening in that context, and that is that acoustic, right? At least to within the context of this piece of it. That is the poet. When I think about the poet had that responsibility. What's the poet do though? Right, the poet is not repeating the words. He's not a tape recorder. The poet is bringing the spirit. The poet is making damn sure that you feel the presence of what is spoken in the tone of voice, right, in the demeanor and the mien, feeling the room. Am I connected? Is it landing? Is the actual thing being brought? John talked about how prior to a certain point, I can't remember exactly when it was, reading was in fact reading aloud in the room, right? And the reader was there was still a felt sense of like, okay, we're in this together. We're kind of collectively having an experience more fundamentally than the transfer of semantic information, the transfer of the dead. And while it's certainly possible that if you and I are in a conversation, I can walk away thinking I understood what you said, but not knowing, it's really, really possible that if I read the words of a 1,000-year-old dead dude that I don't even speak his language natively, that it's quite likely I'm going to walk away with whatever projections I impose upon the encounter and very little of the spirit being conveyed to me. It's just much more likely. So this is another piece of it, right? The move from poetry to prose, and from prose to marketing, which I would say is a slippery slope that is an inevitability, is the move towards the cultural logic of the closed system. Right. That's now we're starting to really get into game A. Right? Game A is not just the visual in sort of one move. It's the intrinsic closedness, right? The intrinsic thermodynamic rivalrousness of that visual space. Right. It's dead. Once it's dead, then you're engaging in algorithmic computational information processing, which has a power to it, no doubt, right? This is why this is another piece of it. You mentioned patriarchy. There's something about the specificity of the inability to convey a lot of things, like, let's say, the essence of childbirth by writing it down. What things can be written down? Accounting. I can write down accounting. That can be written down. I can write down the instructions on how to make a cake, but I can't actually write down the flavor or taste of a well done cake, right? I can't convey quality and sensibility. So, but because I can write it down, it lives last longer than I do, right? It outlasts me. It may outlast me by 1,000 generations. And so it's a selection function. It's like a change in the niche of meaning. And since the niche of meaning shifts, those things that are supported and upregulated and carried by writing start finding themselves more and more and more part of the culture and enculturated environment. And of course, as kids, if we are sort of trained in literacy, then we value that which is conveyed by words, because that's how we work, right? That which is important, that which is shown to be important by the sheer fact of its presence in our lives, gets that energy. We're like, well, I guess this must be important. I'm going to read it. Why is this meaningful? Why do I care about this? Don't know, must, better figure it out. Right. So we invest soul, we invest meaningfulness into the dead words, because it must be important. Otherwise, why the hell are we doing all this? Why does everybody have books everywhere? And that which cannot be conveyed in word, right, which of course is the most part of what's actually meaningful, something starts coming into second place. It starts becoming less important, right? Less potent, less holding of potency. Of course, we can go further and further on that front. Other things that can be conveyed in words, like an org chart and a formal structural hierarchy that you can actually tell you who's the boss and who's not the boss. There's other things that can be conveyed in words. And the fact that Joffrey is actually for sure really an asshole isn't quite as easy to convey in words. You really got to see it up front, particularly since words are easy to manipulate and control. Right? So there's a whole lot going on in that transition that is part of this bigger story. So then we speak about the other thing, right? The move that we're going through. And I don't know if it was on this recording, but you actually named it hypermedia, which is, I was just recently talking about that. And I'm not sure that we're moving into an acoustic space. There's something about what we're doing right here, which is not strictly acoustic. There's something different about this. It's more acoustic than writing, for sure. But it's also different. Like, for example, this is recorded and I presume will be shared in some digital format. So somebody 1,000 years from now in principle could watch it, but couldn't interact with me. I don't think. I don't think I'll be around in 1,000 years to be interacted with, but most likely not. So we're in a new space. We're entering into some new kind of thing, which has a lot of characteristics of the acoustic, and hopefully we'll recover our ability to actually bind communication as to be in service of meaningfulness. But I think
our instead of acoustic, I think he means like more of archaic. Like Terence McKenna had this idea of the archaic revival.
Yeah.
Or this idea of what was the Sand Talk, the book Sand Talk.
Tyson Yonkaprota.
Yeah, what he's talking about there, these old ways that have been
bingo bango, yarning.
Yarning, right?
We can yarn. We can definitely yarn. We're not doing acoustic, but we can yarn right now in this mode. In fact, we are, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, no. So that's interesting. So what will communication look like when you're doing these different methods? And I think it's right that communication doesn't happen unless the change happens, unless there's some kind of transformation. So it's like the transformation theory of communication rather than the transportation theory of communication, right?
Oh yeah, nice.
This mutual reciprocal opening that, with Vervaeke, like the words that you and him kind of have coined, actually lead me to my next question. I framed it in a certain way here. So we live inside our metaphors. We now live inside a computational machine, the machinic assemblage in some sense from Deleuze. So you and Johnny V have coined so many meaningful and rich terms, which mostly come from evolutionary, cognitive, and computational science. But they have an effect and an impact that points to truths outside of these metaphors. So terms like salience, landscape, relevance, realization, commutatorial, explosion, optimal grip, the 4 Ps, they're related to, and they're in the metaphor of the cognitive, computational sense, but they have a lot of meaning. They're rich and they point to like timeless truths in a sense. I don't know if that like specifically relevance realization was one of those terms that was nebulous. It was a constellation of understanding in my head, but once it was coined, it was zoop, wow. And it's been such a powerful tool in my life. And I've been able to apply it to a lot of different areas. And the biggest question, I guess, is can you, and how do you cultivate reciprocal relevance realization? And what's the relationship between relevance realization and prayer?
Oh, you sneak that one in at the end. Okay, let's see.
Well, that's yeah. Oh, sorry.
That's good. I like the well, the first question, how do you cultivate reciprocal relevance realization, is, I would say, the question.
Mm-hmm.
It's a restatement of the fundamental question. And you probably saw the one with Greg Heinrichs where he talked about wisdom energy or wisdom chi.
Mm-hmm.
I think those are the same. Those are also the same. Like we're beginning to point at some bigger, I'll say phenomenon with a number of different languages that help give different perspectives on the question.
Mm-hmm.
How do you cultivate reciprocal relevance realization?
Or maybe just relevance realization on the individual level, right?
Well, my point is that the individual is a cluster
mm-hmm.
of subsidiary parts. So
Mm-hmm.
every individual is the cultivation of reciprocal relevance realization.
Oh, wow.
And so how you do it in your interior, as it turns out, so as above, so below, or whatever that phraseology is how you do it in your exterior, right? So as I learn how to be at peace with myself, how do I learn how to listen to the aspects of myself as they are bringing their particular truth into my shared space, and not to tyrannize or to avoid, but to listen and listen and listen and integrate until it finds a higher tone of selfness in my interior. That is it's a participatory relationship between and among my aspects of self. That same practice and discipline, and also the higher tone self, right? So both the practice and discipline in and of itself, mechanism independent, and the higher tone self, mechanism specific, show up in, say, this conversation, right? So now we are aspects of a larger self. There's a larger self that is presencing in this encounter. And if we can show up at peace with each other, and we can learn how to, as individuals, speak our truth with clarity and connection, continuity, become poets of the infinite into this finite moment, and listen closely to what is being expressed so as to bring it back into the growth of ourselves. And now the growth of this larger self of which you're participating, you start getting this, I hate to use the term because it's very, it gets abused, but it is a fractal holonic metastructure. Right? And it extends infinitely in all directions. It extends down into the infinitesimal combination of the quantum foam up into larger structures, and it goes up into an arbitrarily large we that is the whole of all.
Wow. Yeah, that was beautiful. In this fractal body, right? There are different levels of embodiment, right? What gives a particular level identity that differentiates it and incorporates it into the whole. I think that's this idea of the unification of multiplicity happening at many levels, right? So how do atoms form together to form molecules, right? They have positive and negative charges, right? So positive and negative qualities within human relationships, right? When you're interacting with people at a marriage is, I think, this kind of compensation of positive and negative qualities. So how can we understand atoms forming molecules by exchanging positive and negative electrons, and then molecules, forming cells forming organs, organisms, and then up and down the scale? There's this idea that it's so this idea in Jonathan Pageau, and I guess this will get to the maybe one of our last questions, unless you have some more time. Jonathan Pageau talks about Christ being what unifies the multiplicity and what multiplies the unity appropriately, right? So you can have these nested bodies within each other that make up this fractal whole, right? So it's like this idea. I guess it brings me to the question with regards to Jonathan Pageau. What does he mean by symbolism? What does that mean to you?
I don't know. I don't know him well enough to speak to that.
What
But what I
does it
can
mean
say
to
is,
you? To you?
what do I mean by
Yeah.
symbolism? Or what does symbolism mean to me? Well, can I just comment a little bit on what the quote you just gave?
Yes, please.
And by the way, I'm honestly feeling quite energized. So more time,
Yes.
if it pleases you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Christ, in the sense that you just quoted, yes. That's all I can say. Like, heck yes, that rings a bell for me. Like I have felt and experienced that, and that is if that's the name you want to associate with that particular aspect of reality, then God be with you. And I don't care what name you associate with it, as long as you can hold that cleanly and clearly, and then bring it, most importantly, into life. Right? That's the thing. And the naming of it is neato. The living of it is what's up.
Yeah.
Okay, so symbolism. Ooh, interesting. So the first thing I noticed is I actually have to be quite careful. I have an image of one of Johnny V's meaning crisis videos. He speaks about symbols, and I don't want to copy him. I don't want to ape him. So I have to actually, not utilize my still reasonably sharp memory and do the thing that our educational system taught me to do, but actually listen. Okay. Yes, it's closer to a tuning fork. Yeah, it's closer to what just happened. So there's it's like a reminder of the way that things come together in wholeness. Right? There's the looking or the perceiving of a symbol, like a meme. A meme is a symbol, right? A meme is a skillful, an artful conjunction of phenomena in a way that actually expresses a novel wholeness, right? And so what you get out of that is you get out of it the sense and taste and feeling of artfulness. Get out of it the essence of the emergence of wholeness, how parts come together, how multiplicity becomes unified into a wholeness. And then you get the expression of the wholeness that is literally being expressed in this multiplicity, which carries its own specificity. So that's what it means to me.
Yeah, that was wonderfully said. So it's the finite is an expression of the infinite. And the way that the finite expresses the infinite is through symbolism. Symbol, the Greek etymology is to be thrown together, right? The opposite of the inverse term is diabolical, right? So diabolical and then symbolic. So in terms of the biblical understanding, a symbol is when heaven and earth are appropriately mediated, right? So man is mediator between heaven and earth. Heaven is meaning and earth is matter, right? So it's like when things fit in that coherent whole, that whole is fractaled in the individual, but that individual is a coherent expression of the whole, right?
That's sweet. Yeah.
Finite is an expression of the infinite. And when that's done appropriately, it relevance happens. Like, it's hard to put words to what happens when that happens. It's like, when your son or your daughter's born, right?
I was going to say glory might be a good word for it.
That's symbolism. That's heaven and earth, meaning and matter coming together. We have to break out of our scientific materialistic, or put it in its place of thinking that this is an organism, like a bug that we're studying and classifying. This is not that. And I don't know what it is, but the framework continuously makes it that. And we kind of break out of that and find out what it is to be human and what is human dignity.
Can I take a little bit here?
Please.
So Greg pointed me to a video. It's a conversation between, a guy and another guy. I apologize, I haven't got a lot of specificity. It had to do with persons and souls was the inquiry. And the interviewer was definitely coming from, or at least coming from a scientific materialistic worldview, which is sort of, neuroscience tells me the soul is nonsense. The interviewee was a philosopher who was sort of trying to explain something, and there was something that he was trying to bring into the conversation. The point that came up to me was like, when the scientific materialist was describing something, he just said, well, it's just an emergent process. And it just went on. And one of the curatives I found to the air condition we're in is to slow the fuck down and notice when you're waving your fucking hands. Like, oh, really? What exactly do you mean by that? What does emergence mean?
Right.
Like, let's pin that. We don't get to move one word until we go down to that one and hold it completely. And by the way, your entire worldview is about to explode. So you can't just, and I think that's sort of a big challenge that we have is a railroading, like an excuse to not actually contemplate the thing, but to blast right past it and peppering over it with more of a gesture, more of a right, shoulders shrugged, and of course, But if you just slow down and actually take responsibility for the meaning of the words that you're saying and say, hey, until I can truly own every word and every sentence and can connect to them in this deep poetic sense, right? I'm not just repeating words that I've heard. I'm actually trying to get to the essence of what's being expressed through this mouth. You're not doing anything, right? You're making a mess of things. And if you do that, wherever you start, we're going to end up being in dialogos. Then we're going to be engaging in reciprocal relevance realization together. Sorry, that just came up for me. It was, I guess, irksome.
Beautiful. And I think this is right on in terms of what I see as the structure of game B in terms of relationship, right? I was just talking to my wife. I'm like, these conversations that I see and I'm engaged in, I'm not trying to show you my argument and prove that it's better by attacking yours or by playing these games, whatever it may be. I'm here to listen and understand, and hopefully something, or trust that something will emerge that's interesting, new, worthwhile, enriching, and it's a switch. That's a switch in how things have always been, at least me growing up. And to speak to your idea of emergence, I couldn't agree more. Like, what is emerging out of where? If you say that consciousness is an emergent property out of meaningless matter, like, it doesn't take a little push to say, okay, so how could random meaningless particulates complexify for consciousness to emerge? Why would that happen in a sense? So I'm with you.
Well, what does it even mean? Like, literally, what does that word emergence actually mean?
That's a great question.
What's your cosmology, dude? Like, explain to me how something that didn't be bees.
Yeah.
Like, just give me that at any point. How does something that didn't be? If you can give me that without like bullshitting me, we can begin to move forward. And by the way, that's a good question. Like, it's just a hard question, but it's not something you could just sort of like, hey, consciousness emerges from dead matter. Like, okay.
Yeah.
And what the hell did you just say? Let's explore it.
Yeah.
There was something else there. Yeah. Argument, convincing. I remember actually being reasonably demoralized when I read Haidt's book on what the elephant and his rider, the psychological study of the fact that you can't kind of convince anybody of anything. Because I was like, well, geez, if you can't convince anybody of anything, then we're never going to be able to get anywhere. We can't get along. We're all just kind of stuck in our own silos of crazy town. But then you realize, like, the point was that was always just always a false and usually quite bad, right? You never convinced anybody of anything, but you could dominate and tyrannize people into doing the shit you wanted them to do and not what they wanted to do. Apologize. You could force them to be out of integrity with their own truth and to begin telling stories that you put in their mouths and heads and not what they themselves actually perceive. You could do that, right? That's a thing you could do. And then, of course, you're going to get rebellion and resentment and fragmentation and breakdown, which is to say, tyrannizing meta narratives have a negative consequence intrinsically. All right, cool. All right, now we're aware of what's up. But here's the thing. You don't have to do that. Like, you don't have to do that to get along. In fact, it's the opposite of getting along. When you actually get along with someone, you recognize that what you're actually trying to do is support each other in your growth, in life, in living this together. And that, the relationality, the relationship's a real thing. And as soon as you realize the relationship's a real thing, the binding energy, what happens when you truly and honestly give your earnest, best truth to another human without any expectation other than they will grow from that, from their own point of view, like what makes them who they are. That relationship has strength. And that strong relationship can do stuff in the world. It builds, for example, it builds trust. It's a simple term, but we need to be careful. Like, we live in this crazy inverted topsy-turvy world where almost every term is taken to mean almost exactly the opposite of what it truly means. It's just like Marx kind of was on the right path when he was about putting things on their heads. I don't want to go too far into that one because there's a lot of complexity there for sure. As a double click that one, all kinds of people go crazy quickly. But the point of the inversion, living on the wrong side of the upside down, maybe to put it in a more contemporary vernacular, is a powerful thing. And then, I received a message. I did a conversation with a really cool young man whose name's Sid. And I think I posted it yesterday. And he sent me an email where he had shared the what's that thing called? Substack. I did my first Substack post. It was on the sacred and the profane.
Mm-hmm.
And he'd shared with his friends. He kind of sensed in their comments. And not surprisingly, many people had an allergy to the language of sacred, including my friend Jim Ryan, which doesn't surprise me at all. And the response was, hey, I get it. And we live in upside down land, dude. Let's just assume for the moment that if the word that I used causes your skin to crawl and makes you confused and angry, that maybe you should actually, we collectively can slow down and just focus on what's up.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There's something going on here. And if you think the word means nothing at all, if you literally think this word points to a nullity, then inquire as to how could that be?
Mm-hmm.
Like how often are we in the habit of attending to nullities? Do this. Assume for the moment that and by the way, how often am I, like if you're encountering me, how often do I spend the time to write something down with care and an eye towards poetry and then share it publicly and have the content be a nullity, right? It's not the thing that I try to do. I try not to do that. Let's say I may not be good at it, but I try not to do that. So just bear with me for a minute and imagine the word means something.
Mm-hmm.
What could that be? Let's work backwards. Is there something there? Is there a history, an etymology? Is there a felt sense? Like, is there a way for us to poetry together on this? Because the effort, of course, is to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So as a primary practice, by the way, that awareness of the inversion of language and the importance and the necessity of trying to get past the superficial meaning of the term that you may have received in schooling, by which I mean all of enculturation in this psychopathic civilization that we've been born into, and feel back into its, become a poet of yourself, become the artist of yourself, reconnect with the infinite, and then allow that to fill the word with the meaning that it's, let's say, supposed to carry, or at least is affordant to carry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Bit of a Jeremiah. I apologize. Again, I was irked.
No, there was just 2 points in that conversation where I felt like I was hitting the chest with warmth, and it kind of rippled out when you were talking about how the relationship, like consciousness and talking with people, genuinely hoping and looking for their growth as human beings individually without any recourse to anything that happens to you, and how this grows human beings. And it made me think of this idea of being with my son or my daughter or my other son and paying attention to them, and that love and that attention grows them into human persons, right? And that all of these channels of communication and all these structures around us, media, television, are doing the opposite of that. And is there ways to reorient these incentive structures that cause so much distraction, this marketing? Can we use marketing for good? Is that
God,
possible?
dude. No, you cannot use marketing for good, but I'll do what I just said. I'm going to listen. You're saying something, and what you're saying is needs to be listened to. So first, I just need to kind of almost like, what's the right word? Purge, I think is the term. Boy, Tyson, I tell you, brother, I see that indigenous lifestyle every day. Like, oh my God, we are so lost, so painful. Like so many of our experiences, our lives are just impounded with just toxic everything, everywhere, in every way. It's brutal beyond comprehension. It's amazing that we're still kicking and breathing and loving at all.
100%.
How we unwind that without a hard, restart. I mean, that is the lacuna of game B, to be really hardcore about it. Like this is far from trivial, because reality is far from trivial. If you find the journey to game B to be frustrating and challenging, you aren't even beginning the process of grasping the magnitude of the shit show that we're in. Okay. So, you love your kids and you've learned how to love your kids. Well, that's a good first lesson. Most parents kind of hate their kids. And I don't mean that they're conscious of it, but the way they relate to their kids is brutal. Sometimes, what was the phrase that came up for me? The catastrophe of good intentions, or something like that. And everything, all the things we encounter, not all, so many aspects of the culture that we've produced go in the opposite direction of thriving their specificity, thriving their singularity, enriching their soul. Like we have language. That's a nice, simple, that's exactly the same, enriching the soul. Right? And you want to be in relationship with the other so as to enrich their soul. Now, the challenge that you were just putting forth, say it again, marketing for good.
How do you reorient the incentive structures of social media for clicks and attention, for resources to be extracted for money, towards well-being? Can you, instead of being money, well-being, like for example, the Black Lives
Yeah,
Matter movement that was taken over by corporate forces, right? It gives me a weird sort of hope because the way that it's framed is god awful, but you can leverage these. I don't know if you can. I'm just, I don't know if you can leverage this marketing, advertising, this way of the sublime object of ideology. Can you leverage ideology of what shows up and it drives people's behaviors for good? Or
Oof.
I don't know.
Huh. If this is the image I had was like the Sorcerer's Apprentice.
Mm-hmm.
Be careful, young Padawan. That's the danger. Maybe, but danger. Like careful first on that one. Let's see. But the answer, in some sense, is going to have to be yes. So let's take it simply. Every time you're interacting with any other person, you're definitely playing with their ideology. An adult, you're playing with their egoic structure, their paradigm, whether it's imported malware from third parties or it's self-produced malware. You're dealing with it, and there's a toning to it, right? I think this is the other piece. Like what was coming to me as you were saying was like, look, from one point of view, we're in trouble, because we're in a bad spot. We are so small and so few, and we are overwhelmed by the vastness of that which is against us. But from another point of view, the vastness of that which is against us is fundamentally, intrinsically the finite itself. And in relationship to the infinite, it is as nothing. So there's something like, hey, can we enlist the infinite? That would be a useful ally.
Yeah.
And if I sort of point like I'm seeing now a science fiction image of like, I don't know, Superman's eyes or some kind of robot flashlight where you kind of like blast the ideology. And what it does is that it actually seeks the point of the infinite that was the origin point of every single building block of that structure. And it re-enlivens them from the interior. And then, of course, the ideology will begin to break apart as an ideology, but the pieces parts will now become enlivened and they will wake up. This is, I think, what Johnny D means by steal the culture. Can we breathe life back into the culture? And it's not fait accompli that human nature, human persons are not intrinsically toxic. We're in fact quite the opposite. Right? We're an extension of that which is vital and thriving. Pardon me. I don't want to make a noise here, but my throat's getting dry.
Yeah.
And culture also, and this is important, I think. I don't think that there's a reason to believe that culture per se is destined for nihil. I would say I would make a distinction between culture and civilization, or the thing built on cities, if you follow my stuff on Civium. But I believe there's a tone to be found there. There's a place where we can actually find, and Greg Henricks talks about this as well, there's a location in culture space, or a location in systems of justification space that is in fact actually metastable, in just the same way there's a location in single cell space that we now call multicellular, like in just the same way. And that becomes the foundation for a whole new gig. Like we're at the threshold of moving into a new place. So there's I guess it's a hopefulness, but it's a hopefulness on the basis of a perspective, an awareness of, there are ways of looking at these things that you can look at and actually have, you might call, high confidence in these ways, in these proposals that orients you towards both the possibility. Yeah, there is actually a place we can get to. It's happened in the past. There's examples of these sorts of things happening, and we can look at them and say, okay, we could get there, and it can orient us. So I'll give you an example. The concept of transparadigmatic. What transparadigmatic says is, okay, paradigms are a thing. Right? We're not going to be pre or non-paradigmatic. That's not a thing. That's at least not going to get you very far. But we're going to be trans. We'll be seated in the wholeness. We will be grounded in our self, capital S. We'll be always in continuity of contact with the infinite. And we will be able to instantiate, to manifest paradigms, maybe even bespoke, in response to the context that we find ourselves in. The more sophisticated and skillful we are, the more bespoke they can be. We can design something just exactly for the actual finite context that we find ourselves in. And then we jubilee ourselves back out of it when it is done, right? This is a different relationship to the notion of the paradigmatic. Ideology, I would say, just to kind of define the term, just to make it simple, would be what happens when you sever that infinite finite relationship. When the paradigm takes itself to be the whole, and doesn't remember that it's actually a finite instantiation from an infinite context. And then of course it gets lost, fights like crazy to survive forever, right? Because its death is the end of all possibility of all things. And even prevents you from being able to reconnect with the infinite. Like it fights for its own being dominant. Like you would say, what I would say, and I think this is much to the essence of this thing that I've coined as game A, and is more fundamental than terms like patriarchy, is that, right? It's the tyranny of the finite.
That brought up quickly for me. So what's the first commandment? Is don't worship any God over me, right? Don't build idols. Anything than worshiping the highest high, the infinite, the mystery that you don't know. Anything else, whether it's a golden calf, money, sex, reputation, anything else, even religion, even orthodox, whatever your religion is, that can become an ideology. You have to orient towards the infinite. And that's the first rule. If you do that, then you follow these other rules, right? Which are kind of the source code for right relationship. Don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, don't fornicate uncontrollably, don't sleep with another man's wife. My entire lifetime, I would think of these 10 commandments as, why would God care if you slept with another man's wife? Why would he care if you're jealous of your neighbor's things? The idea is these are the source code. If you follow these rules, relationships will tend to work out between families and communities. And then from there, I think that's what is the kind of the central thing that's missing, is getting back to the right relationship between human beings. And then if we get that right, what you just spoke beautifully about, kind of bespoke reality creation based in integrity and channeling the infinite is possible. And my brain always goes to all these structures are pushing us away from that, more division, more everything, but it's causing a sort of selective pressure for us to adapt and have conversations like this. So there's both tensions here of seems immense and almost undoable. Oh my God, it's creating these avenues and these channels of relationship that are actually nurturing the thing that needs to be done in order for the new to emerge. I think we need to get that into game B. Like that lacuna needs to be filled with the infinite, with God, right? We can't even say God, like the infinite, the God. What does that mean? Right. Christ's two main commandments: love God with all your heart. Well, we've forgotten that. God doesn't even exist for us to even hate him, let alone love him. Love God with all your heart. Love the infinite with all your heart. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself just completely does away with the postmodern problem of the other. The other is your neighbor. If you love the other with all your heart, you get the utopia that you were always looking for, but it's not going to manifest in the way that you're thinking, because it's not a thinking thing. So how do we incorporate love God with all your heart, your neighbor as yourself, into game B?
Yeah, when there's okay, so yes, I agree with you. Good question. It's not easy. I think we have let's just kind of tease a little bit of that apart, because love thy neighbor as thyself. Well, you're gonna have to get good at loving thyself.
Well, the actual commandment is to love your neighbor as God loves you, right?
There you go. There's a difference, right? That's the thing. That's a whole different gig. And to love yourself as God loves you, I'd put in that same mix, right? Because it's going to be tricky to be able to be even, how does God love me? Well, if I don't have an awareness of that, with all your heart, like that actually is to have that connection be open. Just like think of it that, like have the connection be open. And then when that connection is open, that enables you to have that connection be open in this location. So we should probably do by we, I mean like everybody who's having conversations, a nice, very clean, simple historical analysis of how people got so wrapped up around the axle, around terms like God and love. I occasionally get comments from people who are in the kind of more in the boomer tier on my YouTube videos. I had a conversation with a gentleman who just revealed, I think he's in his mid-60s, about Civium and his concerns. Right? Hey, is this a cult? And then, his point of view was, look, I lived in the West Coast and kind of the Bay Area and ran into a whole bunch of cults and cult leaders, and those are yucky, more or less. I'm like, yeah, you're right. And we got to be careful. That's a tricky business for sure. And many of these terms can be weaponized. right? Marketing, right?
Mm-hmm.
We live in a deeply psychopathic civilization, right? Where our minds are trained to not listen to our hearts.
Mm-hmm.
And we are trained to be out of integrity from very, very early age. Oh, and by the way, we're also abused into weak attachment from very early age.
Yeah.
So we're vulnerable to marketing and manipulation and deception. In fact, it's very difficult for us not to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And in ourselves, first and foremost. And so it doesn't surprise me if you really think about that. And then think about the history. Whole institutions existed to extract power and control populations on the basis of particular flavors of marketing and ideology.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they're called churches. Sometimes they're called governments or states or totalitarian regimes. Sometimes they're called corporations, right? There's a whole gig here of how we can be abused by language and terms and manipulation and subtlety and not subtlety, but subterfuge and seduction. And it's appropriate to want to protect yourself from that. It's not just appropriate, it's absolutely necessary. And you got to be able to hear the truth too.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So if you close yourself down to rejecting all words, which is the end state of what that path looks like, then you're disconnected from humans. You're disconnected from communication and disconnected from communion, and you are dead.
Mm-hmm.
If you have no boundaries, you're dead. So what do appropriate boundaries look like? How do we actually create the appropriate boundaries so that we're actually able to move into right relationship fluidly and smoothly? What can I hold? What can you hold? What can the relationship hold? Don't go beyond that. Simple, keep it right. Okay, we found a place that connects. Now we're moving in, just that kind of a thing. It's a relationship. That's the key. Going back to our visual to acoustic,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's maybe the way to put it. Imagine what would happen if you transferred the notion of marketing from the visual to the acoustic.
Mm.
If you transfer it to the acoustic, it's called being in right relationship with other people.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's about being in real connection. It's about reciprocal relevance realization. Right?
Mm-hmm.
It's about skillfulness in that. Right? Marketing is skillfulness in this other thing. Right? This is skillfulness in that thing.
Mm-hmm.
Being good at showing up. Being good at taking, feeling other people's vulnerability and hurt without closing up.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Which are super non-trivial. And
Yeah.
again, and also without giving up,
Mm-hmm.
both. You have to have a boundary that is right. It has to be a semi-permeable membrane that lets the right stuff in and keeps the wrong stuff out.
Mm-hmm.
This frustrates a lot of people, by the way. So many people see that and they're like, well, there's two moves there. One move, which I think is very silly, but I've noticed it's actually reasonably common, is creates this notion of interior work.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of thing, psychology, therapy, medicine work, fill in the blank, as being isomorphic with what the transhumanists called wireheading. You know that
Mm-hmm.
phrase?
Mm-hmm.
Just blissing out or spiritual bypass, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Orienting towards happiness. And that's weird to me. Like, okay, yeah, people definitely, when they do their interior work, there are people who end up going in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe it's even a path that gets a lot of people. But it's not the essence of the thing, even vaguely. The essence of the thing is sovereignty. Or it's not happiness, it's sovereignty. An increasing capacity to be in relationship with other people and with the world. That's the point. Like, that's what that thing is. And that's what spirituality, like with Forrest Landry, when he defines spirituality, he defines it in that way precisely. You're like, okay, so spirituality maps to the notion of skillfulness of being able to be in relationship with experience while maintaining integrity of self and growing maturity of self. Okay, that's cool. That's a neat thing. So we got to build that. And people get very turned off by that because they map it to something which is denatured or decadent. Now I propose not. Let's remap it to something that is, I'd say, is what it is.
Yeah.
And the second piece, then they do this weird thing where they're like, well, but how are you going to, change the world? Right? Isn't poverty and racism and war and climate change, aren't those all bad? How are you going to solve that problem by focusing on spirituality? Here's where it gets real tricky, because the way Forrest describes it, the other word is religion, right? And I wrote an essay on trying to distinguish religion and science and kind of reland it, because we're going to need to regenerate that term. And I've been spending a lot of time talking about commoning and commons and stuff like that. But the proposition is, hey guys, look, sociological techno frameworks on the basis of ideology, visual, semantic, formal structures, right? Org charts they aren't going to save the world. They're the problem.
Mm-hmm.
They may not be the fundamental essence of the problem, but they're definitely like right next to them, egging them on.
Yep.
So if you think that's the thing, then you're already wrong. You're in error, and it's a damaging, tricky one.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that we're not going to get to do that is a good thing. We don't want to do that. That's a bad thing. So what do we want to do? Well, we want to do virtuous marketing. Well, what's that?
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's religion. Well, what's that? Well, again, when I said religion, and if you just map that to non-virtuous marketing,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's not what I mean. Slow down. What do I mean? Well, what I mean is this thing I was describing earlier, reciprocal relevance realization. Right? What I mean is forming relationships that have strength and doing it with continuity. Notice the synergy value there.
Mm-hmm.
My spirituality, my individual sovereignty increases my capacity of relationality. I can be in more relationships more fully and more deeply and build more strength of relationship. And my religion, my structure and superstructure and technique and skillfulness and ritual that supports my relationality, we were just describing, reciprocal relevance realization grows my spirituality. It increases my individual capacity and increases the strength of the relationship. Now what you start seeing is the sort of the mirror image of Facebook. Right? Imagine if you had a social graph, but the social graph was real, meaning that the people really were in relationship, and those relationships were strong and getting stronger, and it was primary. Right? It wasn't there to be extracted, but was there to be built and invested in. And that's your inversion. Right? Yeah. What I would say at the point of view of something like Facebook is kind of super, super simple. Just make it part of the commons. That's it. Hey guys, guess what? Everybody who currently works at Facebook, you still do, but you have no mandate other than to be fully of service to the ennoblement of mankind. That's your job. Your job is that. You happen to be sitting on one of those powerful tools for either the utter destruction and debasement of all that is valuable, or for the renovation and the ennoblement of all mankind. By the way, you probably aren't prepared to actually fulfill your mandate. Got bad news for you. Life has not handed you the wisdom and maturity to take the responsibility that you've got. But we can take it step by step. Stop fucking everybody up for the first part. Let's get the advertisement out of it completely, full stop, no ads. What would it look like to try to create an algorithm that promotes what is Spinoza called joyful encounters? What would that look like? Let's play with it. You've got power. You can do all kinds of great split testing and experiments. How would we know if we've done it? What would be the feedback mechanism that would tell us that we're doing a good job of promoting joyful encounters? And what's the mechanism whereby we become more and more skillful and clever and heartful in promoting them more and more fully? And that's your new mandate. Get to work. What kind of help do you need? And we could do that, by the way, within the context of what humanity is capable of. That's not a very hard move. We've actually done much, much more than that in the past in certain circumstances. Of course, the problem, and this again, and maybe this is maybe where we finish, the meta problem is that we're meta fucked, which is to say that our institutions are a very bad combination of obsolete, corrupt, and incompetent. And so the toolkit itself, if you say, okay, well, who's going to do this? Who's going to make this move on Facebook? It's not going to be the government. Why not? Well, because they're corrupt as fuck and they're wildly incompetent. And the tool itself, the underlying structure of representative democracy in a 1950s to 70s sense, isn't the right kind of tool for doing this kind of thing. States can't run commons. They make a mess of it. You're right. Everybody who says that is right. They're correct. States can't do that, particularly states as we understand them. You get some sort of, you get these bloated sort of socialist utopias called the projects. Right? That's a mess. And I'm not saying that it wasn't well-intentioned. It's a well-intentioned catastrophe. Our lives are littered with those kinds of things. Okay, shit. Oh, do we put it in the market? No, that hasn't worked out very well, has it? That's a terrible idea. That's a slippery slope to degeneracy as rapidly as you can. And they're really good at it now. Do you want more of that? No, you don't want to put the comments in the comments. Okay, great. Well, we've got to do this new thing. Unfortunately, we spent half a millennium utterly destroying our intrinsic capacity to do that third thing. Fortunately, it's base code. Like it's the thing that is the most human nature. It's not out of alignment with human nature. It is human nature. So we're going to have to rebuild that. Bad news, we got to rebuild that. Like that's where it starts. If you don't build that first, then everything else is stillborn or like a zombie, brain, it's out from the moment you've created into the world. If you do that first, then you can actually start doing useful, good, wholesome things. And hopefully we can do that fast enough that we can build this house out of stone and out of hay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right. Well, that got pretty dogmatic at the end. I apologize if it felt a little bit too forceful, but I guess I'm running out of energy.
No, not at all. We need an ark to build. As things the waters rise, we need to take 2 of everything, put it in the ark. The Divine Comedy is an ark, right? Somebody can live on. It's not a boat. Let's build that ark because the storm's coming, man. So, and I'm ready to weather it with you.
All right.
I am.
Nice
Thanks,
to
man.
see you, brother.
Yeah, nice to see you. I really appreciate your time and your energy and opening your heart with me, man. So thanks so much. I'd love to do it again. Any final words of wisdom you can share with us, actually?
Yeah. Thanks to your wife for giving us this space.
Thanks to your wife as well, man. Thanks. I will see you soon. Thanks. God bless. See you. Bye.